Hi friends, welcome to Azure Content. This is part 20 in Azure Data Factory playlist. In this video, we are going to learn about schema mapping in copy activity of ADF pipeline. So let's see everything in details. So first of all, we need to understand what does this term schema means. Okay. So usually whenever we deal with any kind of data, the way in which that data is represented is called schema. Okay. So schema is nothing but the logical representation of any data. So your data can be a relational database or it can be a non-relational database. If it is a relational database, it can be in the form of rows and columns. Okay. Or if it is a non-relational database, it can be in the form of a JSON, which can also be termed as hierarchical data. So schema is nothing but the structure of the data. So suppose there are two tables in which there are two columns and the column names are also same. So we will say that the schema of these two tables are same. Even if the data in both the tables are different, but the way the data are stored are exactly the same. That means the column names or the column orders are same in both the tables. So we can say that the schema of both the tables are same. So I hope you understood what does schema means. Now coming to what is schema mapping in copy activity. So in ADF using copy activity, we usually copy between source to sink. Okay. So from source we extract the data and in sink we load the data. So during this process, if the source and sink schema are different, then we need to use this schema mapping concept. Okay. So by default, there is default mapping. If the source schema and sink schema are exactly the same, then we can go ahead with this default schema mapping. But suppose the source and sink schema are different, or we need to extract only few particular columns from the source, then we can go ahead with explicit schema mapping. Okay. So basically there are two kinds of schema mapping. One is default mapping and other one is explicit schema mapping. So we will talk about both of them one by one. So let's start with default schema mapping. So by default, copy activity maps source data to sink by column names in case sensitive manner. So we will see this practically. Let me go to ADF pipeline, and here we will create a pipeline to copy from one file which is present in my storage account. This file name is file1.csv and it has 4 columns in its schema. Okay. So since it is based on row and column, as you can see here, it is the representation of this file is like a row and column structure. So we can say this is a tabular kind of data. So we are going to load this data from this CSV file to my SQL server where I have created this table called sync table 1. Okay. So its schema is also the same. It has ID, name, quantity and sales. And here it is ID, name, quantity and sales. But the only difference is this quantity column in the source, it is in lowercase. As you can see, QTY, it is in lowercase, but here it is in camel case. That is the first letter is a caps letter, as you can see here. Okay. So let me try to copy the data from the CSV file. So I have this delimited text that is pointing to the same file. If you see this preview data, it will show the same data, as you can see. Okay, so this is the same data as I have shown in the file. Okay, so this data set, let me rename it as ds underscore source data. Okay, so this data set I will use as source data set. Okay, so let me point to source data set. And in sync, let me point to my Azure SQL table. So I have this data set created, which is pointing to sync table 1. Okay. So let's see if this copy activity is able to copy the data from file1.csv to sync table 1 or not. Okay. So let me hit on debug and let's wait for the pipeline execution to be completed. So it's in progress. So you can see it has failed, and if we check the error, it says column name QTY, that is quantity, cannot be found in either source data or column mapping. Okay. So basically in the sync, we have a column called caps QTY, but in the source, it's not able to find any column with this name, or it is also not able to find the column mapping. Okay. So in this case, what we can do is we can either go to the sync, since we cannot change the source data. Usually we do not have access to the source data because it might be coming from the client directly. So either we can alter this table to rename this column, that is camel case QTY, to small case QTY. Okay, so to do that, in Azure SQL DB, we have to write exec statement, exec sp underscore rename, and then we need to give the table name, that is sync table 1, and then the earlier column name, that is QTY in camel case, and comma, and the new name that we want. So it should be small QTY, and the resource that we want to rename, that is column name. So we need to give column explicitly. So let me now run this exec query. So it says it has been completed. Okay, and if we see the select statement now, so you can see the column name has been renamed from camel case to small case. Okay, now if we run the pipeline, let me go ahead and debug the pipeline again. So now it should work because both the schemas are exactly the same, and we have not explicitly defined any mapping here. Okay, so let's wait. Yeah, so you can see pipeline execution is completed successfully, and now if we see, the table has been loaded with the data which is exactly the same as the source data. So basically the first point that we were discussing is that if we are using default mapping, copy activity will only work if schema of both source and sync are exactly the same. And when we say schema, it also includes the case sensitivity of the column names. Okay, so the column names and column orders and also the cases of the columns should also match between source and sync when we are using default mapping. If any of these does not match, then we need to go for explicit mapping. Okay, so we will talk about that later. And the second point is, if sync does not exist, the source field names will be persisted as sync names. Okay, so suppose if this table did not exist in my sync. Okay, so let me drop this table, sync table 1. So now there is no table called sync table 1. If we try to select this, it says invalid object sync table 1. Okay, let me remove this line. So now we do not have the sync table, and now if we try to copy it, it will create the table if we select this auto create table in the sync setting, and it will give the same name to the columns that is present in the source. Okay, so in case of default mapping, the column names should be the same. Okay, so since we have the default mapping, we have not imported any schema and explicitly did any mapping. So if we run this pipeline, it should create the sync table on the fly, and the schema should be exactly the same as the schema present in the source file. Okay, so let's wait for this execution. Yeah, so execution is finished. Let's check the table exists or not. Yeah, so now you can see the table got created on the fly, and if you see the schema, it is exactly the same as the source schema. Okay, and it has also copied the same data as well. So by using the default mapping, we can create the sync table which will have the same field names or the same schema as is present in the source. Okay, so let's move ahead to understand the next point. So it says if the sync already exists, it must contains all the columns being copied from the source. So what it means is, suppose my sync table exists, but it does not have one of the columns present in the source. So to demonstrate that, let me alter this table, sync table 1, and let me drop one of the columns. Let me drop sales column. Okay, so now it will only have 3 columns. So now if we try to copy the data from the source file that is having 4 columns to the sync table that is having only 3 columns using default mapping, Let's see what happens. So since the table is already present, so I'm going to select this none option and let's try to hit debug. Let's see if it works or not. So you can see the pipeline failed with the error saying the column sales is not found in the target side. So when we are using the default mapping, if the sink already exists, then it must contain all the columns present in the source. Okay. So basically the schema between both source and sink should be same if the sink is already present. And if it is not present, then it will dynamically create the sink table and the schema will be exactly copied from the source. Now the next point says if the source is a text file without header line, explicit mapping is required as the source does not contain column names. So let me go back, and this time the scenario is in the source we do not have any column. So here we are treating the first row, that is ID, name, quantity, sales, as the column or the header. Okay, in the source dataset, if I open this, it will be coming as the column names, as you can see here. But in the source dataset, we have an option called first row as header. If we check this, it will treat the first row as the column or the header name. And if we uncheck this, it will remove that from the column name. Okay, so you can see default column name, that is prop 0, prop 1, prop 2, prop 3 are assigned to the column, but the column name is coming as a row. Okay. So now let me do one thing. Let me go to the source file and let me delete this first row that is containing the column name, and let me save this file. Yeah. So now our source file does not contain any column name. And if we go here and if we try to refresh, so now the scenario is the source file does not have any column name, but in the sink it has ID, name, and quantity and sales. Okay. So let me go back here, and we had deleted sales column. Let me add that again. Let me alter this table, alter table, sink table 1, and let me add sales column. Let me give the data type as varchar 20, and let me run this. And now if we see this table, you can see sales column has been added. Let me go back. So if we run this pipeline as it is, it will fail because we have not explicitly done the mapping. Okay, so the mapping tab is still empty. Let me try to show you the same. Since the source does not have any column and it is treating prop 0, prop 1, prop 2, prop 3 as the column names, which is not matching in the sink, so it should fail. So let's see. Yeah, so pipeline failed. Let's see the error. So it says column prop 0 is not found in the target. Okay. So in this case, we have to go for explicit mapping. So first, let's understand what is explicit mapping. So with explicit mapping, we can copy partial source data to sink, or we can map source data to sink with different names, that is different field names, or we can rearrange the column orders as well. Okay. So these are the capabilities if we try to use this explicit schema mapping. So to do that, let me go for importing schemas. So I've clicked on this import schema button, and it has generated the schema for both source as well as destination. So it's mapping the first column coming from the source to ID column in the sink. Similarly, it's mapping second column to name column, and third column to quantity, and fourth to sales. So since the source does not have any column names, it is going for the ordinal position of the columns instead of taking the column names. Okay. So now if we hit on debug, we are expecting that it should be able to copy the data. So since in the table there is already 4 records, so it will be copying the duplicate data. So don't worry about that. We could have truncated the table, or we could have used this sync pre-copy script to write the truncate table script as well. So don't worry if it is getting duplicated. We are expecting that. So pipeline execution is finished. Let's execute this select statement. So you can see the data has been duplicated, but it is not failing because of this explicit schema mapping. Now suppose in the sink, this name column would be ahead of ID column. Okay. So suppose our sink was name, then ID, quantity, and sales. Okay. So in that case, we could have checked this column name and we could have dragged this using these dots. We have to click on that and we can simply hold this to reposition and let it come at the top. So now you can see uh, 2 is coming ahead of 1. So the second column will be mapped to name first and then ID will come and then quantity and sales. So basically you can change the column order in the mapping tab if your sync and source column orders are different. Okay. So to run this pipeline, I need to recreate the table. Let me drop the table first. Let me drop table sync table 1. Okay. And let me recreate this table where name will come ahead of ID. Okay. So let me recreate it and let me show you the table first. So you can see name is coming, then ID, quantity, sales are coming. Okay. So now if we run this, it should work fine because we have mapped the column orders explicitly. Okay. So copy execution is completed successfully. Let's go back and here let me run this select statement. So you can see data is coming perfectly and it is storing the name values in name column, ID values in ID. So there is no mismatch between the column data. Okay, as we have explicitly reordered the schema in the mapping. Okay, in the source it is still the same. The order is ID, name, then quantity, sales. But in the sync, since it was different, so we used explicit mapping and we reordered the columns in the mapping. Okay. And as we discussed, we can also map source data to sync with different names. Okay. So at the very beginning, we had seen that the source file name is ID, then name, then quantity and sales. Okay. So here all are in small cases. Okay. Let me save this. So if you remember using default mapping, it was failing because the case sensitivity was not matching between the source and the sync. And then we altered the sync table in order to match the schemas between both source and sync, and then default mapping was working. But not only case sensitivity, even if the column names are not matching, suppose this column name is profile ID instead of ID. Okay, and this is profile name, and let me hit on save. So even if column names or column orders or columns case sensitivity are not matching, we can go ahead with explicit schema mapping and we can map the source columns and sync columns according to our need. Okay, so let me re-import the schema. And here, since we have changed the schema in the source, so here we need to select profile ID, then profile name, and quantity and sales are same. Okay. Oh, I did some mistake. So we need to select the profile name first because in the sync name is first and then profile ID. So now it has been correctly mapped. So let's run the pipeline. But before that, let me truncate this table so that we don't see the duplicates. Truncate table, sync table 1. And now let's run the pipeline. And let's see even if the column names and column cases and column orders are not matching, it's working or not. Okay. Yeah, so pipeline execution is completed. Let's go to the table and let's check the data. So you can see data has been perfectly loaded just because of mapping it correctly. Okay. So now let's go back to the presentation. So explicit mapping is of 3 types. First one is tabular source to tabular sync, the example of which we have already seen. Our source was a CSV file which was of tabular kind and the sync was a SQL table which was also tabular format. Okay, so we have already seen the example of explicit mapping between tabular source and tabular sync. Okay, now coming to this second category, which is hierarchical source to tabular sync. To demonstrate this, let me go back here and we have a REST API which is having some sample data. So if you carefully see this data, it is of hierarchical structure. Okay, I have already copied this and pasted in a JSON formatter. So this is an online website. You can directly search online JSON formatter and you will get this kind of formatter. Okay, so I have pasted this whole REST API. So if we process this, it will show us the result like a proper format. Okay, so you can see this JSON is having these many properties, that is page, per page, total pages, then data. If I collapse this, then support. Okay, so let's try to copy all the data present in this data array, where these are the column names that I will have in the sync. That is ID, email, first name, last name, and avatar. Okay, so we need to copy all these data as each rows. Okay, so it should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows present in the sync. Once we copy from this REST API to our SQL table. Okay, so this will fall under the category of hierarchical source to tabular sync. Okay, since our source is hierarchical, that is REST API, and sync is tabular, that is SQL table. So let me copy this REST API URL. Okay, so I have copied this, and in the copy activity, I will go to the source and I will create a source dataset pointing to this REST API. So we have to select this REST connector and we have to create a new linked service, and let me paste the base URL. And since we do not need any authentication, so I'm selecting anonymous, and let's test connection and let's create it. Okay, so our source dataset is ready. Let me go to the sync, and we have this sync dataset that is already pointing to SQL table. Let's just create another table. Let me name it as sync table 2. And since this table does not exist, let me go back and let me hit on this auto create table, and let me go to the mapping and let me hit on import schema. So we are going to explicitly map the schema between source and sync. So here, as we discussed, we don't need any other property other than data. Okay, so we will just remove these from the mapping, or we can also delete it from the mapping itself. Okay, let me delete all, and even this support. Okay, so as you can see, we just need this data. We don't need support or any other properties. So I'm going to delete support as well. So we are only having all the properties present in this data. So as you can see, ID, email, first name, last name, and avatar. Okay, ID, email, first name, last name, and avatar. And in the sync, it is going to create a table called sync table 2 with the column names as ID, email, first name, last name, and avatar. So let me try to show you that if there is any table called sync table 2 already or not. So you can see there is no such table called sync table 2. It will on the fly create the table with these column names as its schema. Okay, so let me hit on debug and let's wait. Yeah, so copy activity execution is finished. Let's check the data present in the table now. So you can see it has copied ID, email, first name, last name, and avatar, but it has only copied the first data present in the JSON. Okay, so you can see the first data is having ID 7 and email as Michael Lawson. Okay, so where did the other rows or other data went? Okay, so here whenever you are copying from hierarchical to tabular dataset, what we need to do is we need to use this collection reference, where we need to specify the JSON path of the nested JSON array for cross apply. So basically here we need to select the array which we need to iterate through, and we need to extract all the records or all the JSON present in this array. Okay, else what it will do is it will explicitly take the first row. As you can see, it is taking only 0th index, that is the first property out of this array. Okay, so it is taking only the first JSON of this array. Okay, so we need to select this data array from the collection reference dropdown. And once we did that, let me hit on this import schema again, so that it will no longer be taking only 0th index or the first JSON from the array. Okay, so now you can see it is no longer taking 0th index, and it is treating this data array as the collection reference. Okay, so let me go down and let me remove all these unnecessary properties, because we have re-imported the schema, so it came back again. But now this time it is not explicitly taking only the first JSON. Okay, if we go ahead and see this advanced editor, so you can see all these are coming as an array. Okay, it's not taking the first element. So now if we hit on debug, it should load all the records instead of having only one record. Okay, so let me first truncate the table, think table 2. Okay, and now we don't have anything in the table. So now we will hit on debug for this pipeline, and we are expecting that it will have 6 records getting loaded in the sink. Okay, so let's check if the pipeline execution is completed. Yeah, so it got completed. Let me go to the table and let's check. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 records have been copied from the source REST API. Okay, so if we check starting from 7 till id equals to 12. Okay, so it is exactly the records which are present in the source REST API. So this falls under the category of hierarchical source to tabular sync, as we have mentioned in the presentation. Okay, so we have covered this second category as well. Now coming to the third one, that is hierarchical source to hierarchical sync. So in that case, our source will be the same, that is REST API, which is pointing to this data. And in the sink, let me create a new dataset that is pointing to Azure Data Lake Storage. And to store the hierarchical source data coming from REST API to a hierarchical sink, I will go for this JSON option that can store the hierarchical data. So let me here select the linked service that is already present for my Azure Data Lake Storage, and let me select the path where I want the data to reside in the output. So I have selected ABC output container, and let me hit on this none option for importing schema. Okay, so now if we debug this, we will be expecting that a file or a JSON file will be copied to this output container, which will have this kind of data, okay, in hierarchical format. Okay, so even in this case, if we want to load only data property, then we need to go to the mapping. Let me go for import schema, and we already have this collection reference for data, so we are good. Let me remove all these unnecessary uh, properties. Okay, and let me explicitly give the column name in the JSON, sync JSON, as ID, email, first name, last name, and avatar. And let me hit on debug. So let's wait. Yeah, so execution is completed. Let's check the output file. So it has generated this file that is having .json as the file extension, and it's taking some random file name because in the sync property we have not specified any file name. Okay, so it's fine. Let's go and check the content of this file. So you can see the data is residing in the hierarchical format as is present in the source in the REST API. So it's copying only records present in this data property. Okay, so we are good. Let me go to the presentation again. So we have practically seen all kinds of explicit schema mapping as well as the default mapping in the copy activity. Okay, so that's it for this video, guys. I hope you liked the content. Please hit on like button and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it yet, and also click the bell icon to get notification whenever I add videos. Thank you.